What if bones were not only remains of bodies, but quiet pages in a book that time itself has been writing? Fossils, in that sense, are the notebooks of the earth. They do not rush, they do not exaggerate, they only record what chance allows to survive. When we pause to think of giants, of beings taller than us, stronger perhaps, we might wonder why so few traces appear in this great archive of stone. The scale here is vast. Rocks are laid down in layers, like sheets of paper pressed over millions of years. Sometimes a shell is caught between them, sometimes the branch of a tree, sometimes the skeleton of an animal. More often, though, nothing is preserved. Bone dissolves, wood crumbles, marks vanish before they are sealed. For something to fossilize, the conditions must be rare, almost like the chance alignment of several quiet coincidences. The body must be buried quickly, shielded from scavengers and air. The minerals of soil and water must seep in, replacing fragile bone with stone. Then the pressure of earth must hold it safe until, much later, erosion reveals it again. It is not surprising that so much is missing. We walk on a ground that is more absence than record, more silence than story. Still, when bones are found, they give us glimpses of what once was. We see mammoths, taller than any elephant alive. We see enormous sloths, slow and heavy, now long gone. The earth once supported creatures of sizes that seem almost mythical. Against this background, the thought of a human lineage of unusual height does not seem entirely outside the realm of possibility. It is not proof, only perspective. Let us pause here for a moment. When we think of archives, we might imagine a library. Shelves, books, catalogs. A fossil record is nothing like that. It is more like scraps of paper scattered by the wind, with most of the text already lost. We piece together meaning from fragments, but the missing pages may have carried whole chapters. This is why absence of bones is not the same as absence of life. What survives is only what chance has spared. Our knowledge is bounded by this lottery of preservation. It may be that a giant-like branch of humans once lived and left no durable fossils. Or it may be that such a branch never existed. Both possibilities are open, and the ground beneath our feet does not hurry to decide for us. The traces we do find are modest. Now and then, skeletons larger than usual appear in excavations. Some belong to individuals with growth conditions, what medicine calls gigantism. Others are simply tall variations within the wide frame of normal human diversity. A few remain uncertain. The bones tell us little beyond their shape, their wear, their mineral mark. They do not speak directly, only through careful reading. And careful reading means slow comparisons, patient measurements, statistical patterns. Each discovery is like a letter in a long word, whose meaning is never fully spelled. If we allow ourselves a gentle thought experiment, we can imagine a small population of humans, taller than most, living in some quiet valley or forested plateau. For a few thousand years they survive, leaving tools, perhaps shelters, perhaps marks in stories. Then climate shifts, or neighboring groups grow more numerous, and slowly their presence thins out. Their bones, if buried, are scattered, washed away, or dissolved before fossilization can occur. What remains is not their bodies, but whispers, a myth told by neighbors, a vague impression carried across generations. With time, myth stretches them taller still, until they become the giants of legend. Through this lens, the fossil record is less a definitive verdict, and more a partial language of traces. Each fragment, each layer of sediment, is a quiet note in a melody we can barely hear. Sometimes we imagine missing parts, sometimes we fall silent in front of the unknown. Both responses are part of our human way of making sense of time. As we close this moment of reflection, let us carry the thought that fossils are not a complete record, only glimpses through a narrow window. The silence between them may hide whole species, or it may hide nothing at all. We cannot know, and in that space of unknowing, the stories of giants continue to find room, not as evidence, but as echoes, folded gently into the long patience of the earth. What if myths are not only inventions of imagination, but also vessels carrying fragments of memory across centuries? Oral traditions often act like rivers. They may twist, they may overflow, but some pebbles from their source are carried far downstream. The stories of giants may be such pebbles, polished by countless retellings, reshaped by changing voices, yet still holding a hint of something once seen. When we think of memory stretched over generations, it is useful to remember scale. A single life spans decades, perhaps a century, but oral tradition can flow for thousands of years, handed from elders to children, like a torch passed in the dark. With every step, details soften, exaggerations grow, meanings shift. Yet within the shifting there can remain a kernel, a steady weight that resists full erosion. Giants in myth may be that kernel, a reflection of encounters with humans who seemed different enough to be set apart. The mechanism of this preservation is simple, though fragile. In societies without writing, knowledge rests in stories. A myth is not just entertainment, it is also an archive, a way of remembering where food is found, when seasons turn, what dangers lurk. Over time, practical instructions and extraordinary encounters share the same vessel. To ensure survival, stories are repeated, sometimes in ritual, sometimes around fires, sometimes woven into song. The rhythm helps memory. Repetition carries it forward. In this way, even an unusual event, seeing a taller stranger, meeting a group that seemed unlike one's own, can remain alive in narrative form long after the encounter itself has faded from living memory. Now let us pause a moment on what we do not know. Oral traditions are not precise records. They do not measure height in centimeters, they do not date events with calendars. They exaggerate, condense, and color with meaning. When we listen to them today, we cannot easily separate metaphor from observation. Was a giant truly tall, or simply powerful, or morally great? This ambiguity makes myths both rich and difficult. They speak, but they do not always explain. The language of traces here is not bones or stones, but words and patterns. We find giants not in fossils but in recurring motifs across cultures. In Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, the image repeats. Beings larger than ordinary humans, often strong, sometimes foolish, sometimes wise. The repetition is itself a kind of data. Like a statistical cluster, it suggests significance, though the meaning remains open. Are we seeing coincidence, the natural human tendency to magnify, or are we glimpsing a faint echo of encounters with others? We cannot settle the question. Still, the persistence of the motif is a signal worth noting. To explore this gently, we can try a thought experiment. Imagine a small community, living in valleys where the average height is modest. Into this valley comes a traveler, perhaps from a population adapted to different conditions, taller by half a head. To the locals, this figure seems extraordinary. The encounter is told and retold. Children hear it, then grandchildren. Over centuries the details blur, but the central impression remains. There was once someone unlike us, taller, stronger. Over still more time, the figure grows with each telling, until it becomes a giant. Now imagine that such encounters were not singular, but occasional, across different lands and ages. Each community, in its own way, added the story of giants to its shared memory. In this way, a scattered set of experiences might bloom into a global pattern of myth. This does not prove a species of giants existed, but it does offer one quiet path for understanding how the motif endures. Before moving on, let us rest with a small observation. Memory, whether personal or collective, is never exact. We misplace details, we reshape events, we soften or harden edges. Yet memory still points toward something. Even when distorted, it carries weight. Myths are the collective version of this imperfect process. They are not photographs of the past, but perhaps sketches. Sometimes the lines are too bold, sometimes too faint, but they are lines nonetheless, drawn by human hands trying to recall what once was. And so we end with a soft pause. Myths of giants may be pure imagination, symbols of power or moral lessons wrapped in oversized forms. Or they may hold a faint echo of real encounters with humans who no longer walk beside us. The truth is hidden in the folds of time, and perhaps it will remain hidden. What remains to us is the rhythm of stories, still flowing, still carrying their polished pebbles downstream. What if extinction, a word we often reserve for animals long gone, was also part of the human story? Not only for the creatures we imagine in distant jungles or seas, but for close relatives, other humans who once breathed and walked under the same sky. To think of extinction is to think of endings, yet endings come in many forms. Sometimes they arrive suddenly, like a candle blown out by wind. Sometimes they come slowly, like a fire burning down to embers until nothing but ash remains. In the language of biology, extinction means the end of a lineage, the moment when no members remain alive to carry it forward. For humans, it can mean the vanishing of entire branches of our family tree, leaving us as the only ones still standing. The scale here is immense. Life has existed on Earth for billions of years. In that time, almost every species that ever lived has disappeared. Extinction is not an exception, it is the rule. Against this backdrop, the thought of another humankind, perhaps taller, perhaps stronger, fading into silence is not strange. It fits the quiet rhythm of life's turning pages. Now we pause to look at how extinction happens. Often it is linked to change. Environments shift. Ice ages come and go, rivers alter their paths, forests thin out, deserts spread. Species that once thrived find their food scarce or their shelters gone. Some can adapt, others cannot. Sometimes the cause is competition. Two species may rely on similar resources, and one gains a small advantage. Over time, the advantage grows, until one survives while the other dwindles. Sometimes the cause is mingling, where one lineage blends into another until it loses its distinct form, absorbed rather than erased. Each path is gradual, more like dusk than sudden nightfall. Yet when viewed from a distance of thousands of years, the result is the same. A species once present is present no longer. Our knowledge of these endings is partial. Fossils preserve only fragments, and even those are rare. Genetic studies open new windows, but only if we have samples to compare. Many possible lineages may have left no durable trace, dissolved in the soil or in the blood of descendants. This is why we must be cautious. To say we have found no proof is not the same as saying it never was. The absence may reflect the silence of evidence, not the silence of history. Still, there are indirect signals, what we might call the language of traces. Layers of sediment can show sudden shifts in climate, moments when many species vanished at once. Archaeological sites can reveal breaks, where one type of tool or dwelling gives way to another, suggesting changes in who lived there. Genetic patterns in our own DNA hint at mingling with unknown ancestors, their names lost, but their presence faintly recorded in the code we carry. These signs are not direct testimonies, but soft shadows cast on the ground. To follow them is to walk carefully, aware of how much remains unseen. Let us linger now with a simple thought experiment. Imagine a population of humans who, by chance of evolution, grew taller than their neighbors. Their height might give them advantages in hunting or in strength. For a while they thrive. But climate changes. The food they rely on grows scarce. Their size, once an advantage, now requires more energy than the land can provide. Slowly, generation after generation, their numbers thin. Some blend into nearby groups, leaving children who carry a trace of their height. Others die without descendants. After many centuries, none remain who bear their full form. What is left is memory, neighbors who recall them, stories told of tall ones who once walked among ordinary people. Over time, memory stretches, until the tall become giants in legend. This scenario cannot be proven, but it shows how extinction and memory might weave together, leaving myths as the only survivors. Before we move forward, we can rest with the recognition that extinction is both common and mysterious. Common because it has touched nearly all of life. Mysterious because its traces are often incomplete, scattered like half-buried footprints. When we listen to stories of giants, we may be listening not only to imagination, but also to echoes of these endings. Perhaps they were real, perhaps they were not. We cannot know with certainty. What we can do is hold open a space where both possibility and humility coexist. And in that space, the thought of giants as an extinct humankind lingers quietly, neither confirmed nor dismissed, but carried gently into our reflections. What if the earth itself, layer by layer, quietly holds the memory of what once lived, waiting for us to notice? Fossils are not only bones turned to stone, they are fragments of time, sealed within sediments that behave like slow, patient scribes. Each layer of soil and rock is a page, pressed by centuries, written not with ink but with minerals and impressions. When we think of giants or any beings lost to history, it is here, in these geological notebooks, that we would expect to find some trace. The context stretches far beyond human lifespans. To fossilize, remains must endure processes that often take millions of years. A creature dies. If the body is covered quickly by sand, mud, or volcanic ash, it may escape scavengers and decay. Slowly, water rich with minerals seeps through, replacing the organic matter cell by cell. What was once bone becomes stone, faithful in shape but different in substance. This is the mechanism of preservation, delicate and rare. Most bodies do not make it through. They vanish into soil long before stone can embrace them. That is why the fossil record is so thin, more like fragments of a burned library than a full set of books. We pause here because the limits are important. The record is uneven. In some regions, entire layers are missing, washed away by erosion. In others, sediment piled too gently to preserve detail. Whole epochs can appear blank. This means that absence in the record does not necessarily equal absence in reality. The missing may simply have left no durable mark. For those who wonder about giant humans, this silence can be both frustrating and intriguing. It leaves space for possibility, but also cautions us not to leap too quickly toward conclusions. The language of traces here is subtle. In addition to bones, we look at the sediments themselves. Layers of ash tell us of ancient eruptions. Pollen grains, preserved like tiny fossils, show us what plants grew. Even isotopes, the chemical fingerprints of oxygen and carbon trapped in stone, whisper of climates long past. These are indirect signals, but they help us reconstruct the stage on which life unfolded. If giants had lived, their remains would depend on the same fragile lottery as all others. The odds are never generous, yet the layers continue to speak, even if faintly, telling us of what survived and hinting at what may have slipped away. Now let us try a gentle experiment of imagination. Suppose, in a valley where rivers brought steady floods of silt, a group of unusually tall humans lived. One season, after a sudden storm, their dwellings collapsed, and some bodies were buried quickly in the wet earth. If the conditions were just right, their bones might begin the long journey toward fossilization. Thousands of years pass. Sediment hardens to stone. Later, the valley lifts in a tectonic shift, and erosion slowly peels it back. Eventually, fragments of unusual bones reach the surface, waiting for eyes to see them. But if the burial never happened, or if erosion carried them away before discovery, the memory would remain only in stories, not in stone. This is the quiet balance of chance and loss. Before moving forward, we may pause with a smaller observation. The fossil record, though incomplete, shows us that large beings have walked this earth many times. Towering trees, immense reptiles, enormous mammals, forms that dwarf our own, once filled landscapes. If size alone seems improbable for humans, we need only remember how scale has shifted again and again in life's history. This does not prove that giant humans existed, but it softens the boundary of possibility. The Earth has already hosted many improbable shapes, and so we close this reflection with caution. Fossils give us glimpses, not a full picture. They remind us that what we know is partial, stitched from fragments of stone. Whether giants once left their bones in the earth, or whether they lived only in the flowing rivers of story, remains uncertain. What is certain is the patience of the earth, still holding pages we have yet to read, still whispering, softly, of what has passed and what has been forgotten. What if the words left to us in old texts are themselves traces, soft impressions of meetings long forgotten? Ancient writings, whether in stone, on papyrus, or passed through later copies, often speak of beings taller, stronger, and set apart from ordinary people. We do not need to treat these accounts as precise reports. They are not measurements written in numbers. They are closer to echoes in a valley, sounds reshaped by distance, carrying only the tone of awe or fear. Yet the persistence of giants across so many traditions invites us to pause. When we open these texts, we find the Bible describing the Nephilim, figures remembered as mighty and large. In Greek epics, heroes meet towering opponents whose size seems beyond human. In Norse sagas, the Jotnar are not merely tall but vast, embodiments of forces beyond control. In Mesopotamian myths, kings trace their lineage back to beings of unusual stature. These are not identical stories, yet they share a common thread. Size as difference, height as a marker of otherness. It is important to note that texts are products of their time. They combine observation with imagination, memory with meaning. Writers of the past did not separate myth from history in the way we try to now. For them, to describe someone as a giant could mean literally taller, or symbolically greater, or both. This is why we cannot read these passages as clear proof, but neither should we dismiss them without care. They are signals, however distorted, that something about size made a deep impression worth preserving. Now we pause for a moment to notice how texts themselves are fragile. Unlike stone, they decay. Many survive only in fragments or translations. Copyists changed words, added glosses, sometimes altered entire passages. What we hold today is already filtered through centuries of transmission. This limitation means we must tread lightly. When an ancient writer mentions giants, we cannot know if they recorded a memory of unusual people, or a metaphor for power, or simply a narrative device. The ambiguity remains, and with it, the humility of not claiming certainty. Still, texts leave indirect markers. We can look at where and how the idea of giants appears. We see clusters, in regions where different cultures met, in times when migrations unsettled the known order, in moments when memory of older peoples lingered as story. This distribution is itself a kind of data. It does not prove a species, but it shows a pattern. Size was remembered, remarked upon, repeated. The language of traces here is not physical remains but cultural echoes. They survive like faint imprints in clay, shapes whose edges blur yet whose presence is undeniable. Let us rest for a while with a thought experiment. Imagine a traveler from a community of unusual height arriving in a smaller village. The villagers, surprised, describe him to others as a giant. A scribe records the tale. Centuries later, another scribe copies the story, adding flourishes. The figure grows taller still, his strength exaggerated. Generations later, the text is read aloud in temples or halls. Now the giant is not only a man but a symbol of something larger, chaos, danger, or awe. In this way, a single encounter is stretched across time until it becomes part of a written tradition. Now, if this happened not once but in many places, at many times, we can see how a global chorus of giant tales might emerge, each rooted in some fragment of memory, then expanded by the hand of storytelling. Before moving further, let us also consider how texts function as bridges. They link past to present, but in doing so, they reshape what they carry. A story of a tall stranger may be retold as a warning, or as inspiration, or as allegory. The core may be real or imagined, but the shape we inherit is always touched by meaning. This layered quality makes ancient texts both rich and uncertain, like tapestries woven from threads we can no longer separate. And so, we close softly with an open thought. Ancient writings about giants may hold echoes of real encounters, or they may be pure metaphor, or a mixture of both. We cannot say with finality. What we can say is that these texts, fragile yet enduring, show us that the idea of larger beings mattered deeply to those who wrote. They preserved it across centuries, so that even now, in our quieter hours, we still pause to wonder at the shadows those words describe. What if the sense of size itself, the way we perceive height and scale, is one of the roots of the stories we carry? A giant does not always need to be impossibly tall. Sometimes it is enough to be taller than those around. In small communities where the average height was modest, even a difference of a head could appear enormous. To a child, the world of adults already feels giant-like, each gesture magnified by perspective. The idea of giants may begin in such simple contrast. Context helps us see this more clearly. Across different times and regions, human populations have not been uniform in size. Nutrition, climate, and genetics all play a role. In colder climates, shorter and more compact forms conserve heat. In open plains, taller frames may be favored. These differences, though measured in inches, can feel dramatic when seen through the eyes of those who stand much smaller. Perception amplifies difference, turning tall into towering, and ordinary variation into mythic scale. The process is easy to imagine. A traveler from a distant region arrives in a village where no one matches his stature. His presence lingers in memory, retold with awe. Over time, the description stretches, as memory often does, until he becomes a giant in the tale. This mechanism, repeated across centuries and continents, may explain part of why giant stories are so common. Yet here we must pause and acknowledge what we do not know. We cannot reconstruct with certainty the average heights of all ancient groups, nor how they perceived each other. Skeletal remains give us glimpses, but they are scattered and incomplete. Texts and myths preserve impressions, but not measurements. The gap between data and perception remains wide. What we can do is look at indirect traces. Archaeological sites sometimes reveal populations shorter or taller than neighboring ones. Tools and dwellings, scaled to their makers, provide subtle clues. A doorway that seems low to us may have felt perfectly natural to those who built it. Clothing fragments, rare though they are, also hint at body sizes. These are quiet signals, reminding us that variation in stature has always been part of the human record. Now let us rest a moment with a thought experiment. Imagine a community living in a mountain valley, where food is limited and frames remain small. One day, traders arrive from the lowlands, taller, broader, shaped by different conditions. To the valley people, they seem immense, almost otherworldly. The story of their visit is retold through generations. Later, when another group passes through, the tale grows, blending fact with memory. Over centuries, the visitors become not just tall traders but legendary giants, remembered long after their true proportions are forgotten. The next step is easy to see. When such encounters happen in many regions, each culture builds its own version of the giant story, shaped by the contrast between self and other. In this way, giants become universal not because they existed as a separate species, but because perception itself magnifies difference into myth. Now, before moving forward, we can pause again on the simple thought that scale is always relative. To someone from the past, our modern height, strengthened by nutrition and medicine, might itself seem remarkable. We may appear as giants compared to some ancient group. This reminder softens our judgment. It shows us that the line between myth and perception is not sharp, but blurred by shifting standards. And so we close gently with an open reflection. Giants in myth may not always point to a vanished branch of humanity. Sometimes they may simply be mirrors of perception, memories stretched by difference in height, told and retold until they grow larger than life. This does not solve the mystery, but it helps us see one quiet path by which ordinary variation can leave extraordinary stories. What if the scattered discoveries of tall skeletons are not just anomalies of biology, but faint reminders of something more? From time to time, archaeologists uncover human remains that stretch beyond the usual range, bones longer than expected, frames that seem to rise above the ordinary pattern. Often these finds are explained through conditions we know today, such as gigantism, where the body grows unusually tall because of hormonal imbalance. But sometimes, when the evidence is less clear, we are left with a gentle uncertainty. The context is wide. Across human history, there has always been variation in height. In some eras, poor nutrition or illness kept average stature low, making any tall individual stand out sharply. In other periods, healthier diets allowed groups to grow taller, narrowing the contrast. The skeletons we find belong to specific moments, preserved by chance, not chosen to represent the whole. This makes interpretation delicate. A few bones cannot tell us the full story of a population. They are snapshots without a full album. Still, they are worth our quiet attention. Now let us pause to consider how these skeletons reach us. Soil preserves differently in different places. In dry caves, bones may endure for millennia. In damp earth, they may dissolve within centuries. The few that survive form the archive we study. But just as an incomplete library does not mean the missing books never existed, so too the absence of numerous tall skeletons does not rule out the possibility of taller groups once living. We must read carefully, knowing how much is silence between the pages. The language of traces here includes measurements of long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri. From their length, we can estimate the height of the living person. These calculations, though precise in method, rest on assumptions, since body proportions vary. A femur that seems extraordinary may indicate a person well above average, or simply someone with different proportions. Archaeologists also look for clustering. A single tall skeleton may be an anomaly. Several in the same region could suggest a broader pattern. Yet the number is always small, the pattern never complete. This is the boundary of our knowledge. Now we may try a thought experiment. Imagine a community where, for genetic reasons, many individuals grew taller than neighboring groups. For a few generations, this was simply their norm. They lived, built, hunted, raised children. Then, climate shifted or resources dwindled, and their community thinned out. Some members married into nearby groups, passing on fragments of their tall frame. Others left no descendants. Thousands of years later, a handful of their bones remain, uncovered by archaeologists. To us, they appear as scattered tall skeletons, hard to interpret, impossible to link with certainty to the myths of giants. Yet, for their neighbors, the memory of these people may have been strong enough to survive in story, where tall became giant, and human became something more. Before we move further, we can pause on a simple truth. In statistics, we often see outliers, points far above or below the average. They remind us that variation is natural. But when outliers cluster, they may indicate a hidden trend, something not yet understood. Human remains work much the same way. A few tall skeletons could be outliers, or they could be faint markers of a population now gone. We cannot yet tell. And so we close with a quiet recognition. The long bones uncovered in soil may speak of individuals, not species, of chance, not lineage. But they also remind us that human history has always been wider than its averages, broader than its means. Whether these tall remains were simply rare individuals or hints of a larger story, we cannot be certain. What remains is the gentle awareness that every anomaly is also a doorway, opening into questions we may never fully answer, yet may still carry with us like a slow echo across time. What if entire branches of our human family once lived quietly, leaving behind only faint fragments, almost invisible, until chance revealed them? The story of the Denisovans reminds us how little can survive, and yet how much can be inferred from the smallest remains. In a cave in Siberia, only a few pieces were found. A fragment of finger bone, a tooth, later a fragment of jaw. At first glance, these were just bones, like many others in the deep earth. But when their DNA was studied, it opened a new chapter in human history. A whole lineage was revealed, one that had lived alongside Neanderthals and early modern humans, one that left almost no visible trace, yet continues to exist within the genetic code of some of us today. The scale here is humbling. For tens of thousands of years, Denisovans lived, hunted, raised children, and vanished, without leaving monumental ruins or written records. If not for the careful preservation of a single bone fragment in the cool dark of a cave, we might never have known they existed. This shows us that the archive of humanity is fragile, yet also full of hidden depth. The mechanism that made this discovery possible lies in the study of ancient DNA. Within bones, tiny molecules carry genetic information, like instructions for building a body. Normally, these molecules decay quickly, but under the right conditions, stable temperature, dryness, or deep cold, they survive long enough to be read. When scientists extracted the Denisovan DNA, they could compare it to ours, seeing where the strands overlapped and where they diverged. The differences marked them as a distinct branch, not Neanderthal, not modern human, but something in between. The limitations, however, are clear. We have only a handful of remains, not enough to reconstruct their average height, their appearance, or their full range. We know they mingled with some of our ancestors, since traces of their genes survive in people today, particularly in parts of Asia and Oceania. But beyond this, their culture, their language, their daily life, these are unknown. What we hold is only a shadow. Still, the language of traces is rich. Genetic signals are like whispers from the past. They do not give us images, but they show us connection. In the DNA of present-day humans, Denisovan fragments are embedded like faint watermarks in paper. Some of these genes affect how bodies handle high altitudes, a hint that Denisovans lived in mountain environments. Others touch on immune responses, subtle markers of adaptation. These are not visible bones or tools, but they are records, written into living bodies. Let us rest with a thought experiment. Suppose another group of humans, perhaps taller than the rest, once lived in valleys or forests now long eroded. Their bones dissolved, their tools scattered or unrecognized. But perhaps fragments of their genetic code remain, carried forward quietly in some populations. If one day we read those fragments and see differences large enough, we might discover another branch, as unexpected as the Denisovans once were. If this happened, we might realize that the stories of giants, those tales of beings taller, stronger, different, were not entirely invention, but faint memories of such encounters. Now, before we drift further, we pause to notice the broader lesson. If a whole human lineage could vanish almost entirely, leaving only a few bones and scattered genes, then the absence of clear evidence for giants cannot be treated as proof against their existence. It is simply an unfinished page. The earth has not yet shown us everything it holds, and so we close with quiet openness. The Denisovans remind us that hidden histories can emerge from the smallest traces. Whether giants belong to myth alone or to biology as well, we cannot yet know. What we do know is that the archive of humanity is still unfolding, and its silences are as meaningful as its words. We carry this awareness gently, letting it rest beside the stories we inherit, neither dismissing nor confirming, but holding both possibilities in balance. What if myths, beyond their images and exaggerations, were not only entertainment but also quiet vessels of knowledge? In cultures without writing, stories served as memory, carrying lessons, histories, and warnings across centuries. Like jars filled with grain, myths preserved fragments of the past so they would not be lost. The figure of the giant may have been one such vessel, a way of keeping the memory of encounters with unusual people or with distant ancestors alive when no written record could do so. The context here is vast. Across the world, human communities relied on oral tradition, repeating and reshaping stories so that they would survive. To remember where water lay, they told tales of rivers hidden by spirits. To recall dangerous seasons, they spoke of great beasts appearing when the moon was thin. And to hold the memory of people who seemed taller, stronger, or somehow different, they may have woven the image of giant. These stories shifted in form but carried a kernel of memory within them. The process is simple to imagine. A story is told around a fire. It is repeated to children, then to grandchildren. Each retelling changes it slightly, like a stone polished by many hands. Details are lost, others are added, but the central impression remains. A tall figure once seen becomes a towering presence in memory. Over centuries, ordinary difference becomes extraordinary myth. Now let us pause for a moment on the limits of this process. Oral traditions are not precise. They do not keep measurements or dates. They blur events and fold generations together. They add layers of symbolism, turning people into archetypes and experiences into lessons. This means we cannot take myths as direct evidence. At the same time, we cannot dismiss them entirely. To survive so long, they must have carried meaning important enough to be repeated. The balance lies in reading them as signals rather than as photograph. They do not show us the past directly, but they hint at shapes within it. The language of traces here is cultural, not physical. Patterns in myths function like statistical clusters. When similar themes appear in distant cultures, they suggest that something, whether perception, experience, or imagination, was strong enough to recur again and again. Giants belong to this pattern. We see them in European legends, in Pacific Island tales, in the Americas, in Africa. The distribution itself is a kind of marker showing that size, real or imagined, left a lasting impression across human memory. Now let us rest with a thought experiment. Imagine a small community meeting a group of strangers from another region. These strangers are taller, their build unfamiliar. The meeting is brief, but it leaves a mark. Children are told of the encounter, and the story grows with each generation. After many centuries, the details are lost, but the image of tall beings remains. The community may even place them into a larger narrative, turning them into protectors or into threats, depending on how memory shaped emotion. Later still, when writing emerges, these tales are recorded, but by then the figures are already giants, no longer ordinary humans. In this way, memory and myth intertwine, one preserving fragments, the other expanding them. Before we move further, let us notice something quiet. Myths, even when exaggerated, often hold practical cores. A tale of giants may remind a community of the time when outsiders came, when something unusual disrupted ordinary life. The lesson is carried forward not in measurements, but in feeling. This emotional truth endures longer than detail. And so, we close with a gentle recognition. Myths as storage show us how human cultures preserved what mattered, when no paper or stone carried their words. The stories of giants may be echoes of real encounters, or symbols of difference, or both. We cannot decide with certainty. What we can do is acknowledge the resilience of memory, carried in voices across centuries, shaping echoes into figures that still walk with us in story, long after their original form has faded into silence. What if the earth itself, with its slow layers of soil and stone, is the only true witness to what has passed before us? Geological time moves at a rhythm almost impossible for us to feel. Millions of years can pass as gently as a single season feels to us. Sediment builds grain by grain, carried by rivers, laid down by wind, pressed by glaciers. Each layer is a page, though most pages remain unread, sealed deep beneath our feet. When we think of beings now gone, whether ordinary or extraordinary, it is within this patient archive that we might hope to find their traces. The process is simple in principle, yet rare in practice. For a bone to become fossil, it must be buried quickly, before air and animals scatter it. Minerals in water must then slowly replace the organic material, preserving shape while substance changes. Over time, earth hardens, holding the form like a pressed flower in a book. But unlike flowers, bones are heavier, more fragile, more likely to dissolve before they are sealed. That is why the record is thin, why most creatures leave no fossil at all. And so, we move gently to the limits of what we can know. Absence of remains does not prove absence of life. It proves only that the chain of chance did not favor preservation. Whole populations may have risen and fallen, leaving not a single bone preserved. Erosion, floods, and volcanic eruptions may have erased traces before they could harden into stone. This silence is as important as the fossils we do find. It reminds us that our knowledge is stitched from fragments, never from a complete whole. Still, there are indirect ways to listen to the Earth's memory. Layers of sediment carry signals of climate, pollen grains showing which plants grew, isotopes of oxygen and carbon whispering the temperature of seas. Ash layers tell of eruptions, sudden disruptions that reset landscape. In some places, sudden shifts in layers coincide with disappearances of species. These are markers of extinction, though we rarely know the full list of what was lost. If a tall human lineage had once existed, its vanishing might be marked not by bones but by a break in settlement layers, a sudden change in tool types, or the silence of abandoned caves. These indirect signs are part of the language of traces, subtle but real. Let us pause here for a thought experiment. Imagine a group of unusually tall humans living near the shore of an ancient lake. For centuries they thrive, hunting fish and gathering plants. Then climate shift. The lake shrinks, the land dries, and resources thin. Some leave, mingling with neighboring groups. Others remain until their numbers dwindle. Their bones, scattered on the surface, are washed away by storms, dissolved by rain. No fossils form. What remains is the layer of sediment from the drying lake, a shift in pollen grains showing the plants that vanished, perhaps a few tools too large for smaller hands. Thousands of years later, these signals are uncovered. We do not find their bones, but we sense a change, a gap, a silence where a presence once was. Now we return to the broader rhythm. Geological time does not favor the small stories of individuals, but it sometimes leaves space for the outlines of whole lineages. The giants of story may never appear in stone, but the Earth's slow memory may still hold the conditions that framed their lives and their disappearance. Reading these conditions is like tracing shadows on a wall. We see shapes, but not the bodies that cast them. And so we close with a quiet reflection. The geological archive is not complete, but it is steady. It reminds us that time is vast, that preservation is rare, and that absence of evidence is not final. Giants may never appear in stone layers, or perhaps their traces lie hidden still. All we can do is listen with patience to the Earth's slow language, aware of its silences, aware of its whispers, and careful not to confuse one for the other. What if the most durable archive of our shared past is not stone or paper, but the quiet code within our own bodies? DNA, the long molecule that carries instructions for life, is like a library written in chemical letters. Every one of us holds within our cells fragments of history, traces of our ancestors, both known and forgotten. In this sense, our blood and bones are not only alive but also record keepers, storing echoes of lineages that no longer walk beside us. The context here stretches far. Over the last few decades, the study of ancient DNA has shown us that our family tree is more complex than we imagined. For much of modern science, we thought humans stood alone, preceded only by Neanderthals. But then, in fragments of bone, other names emerged: Denisovans, mysterious relatives known almost entirely through their genetic traces. This was a reminder that the past can linger in us even when fossils are rare. The mechanism is delicate yet powerful. When two human groups meet and have children, genes mix. The descendants carry pieces of both lineages. Over time, as generations multiply, most of those pieces fade, but some remain. This process is called genetic introgression, a quiet blending of lineages. Even if one group disappears physically, its genetic signature can persist. It is as though a melody survives inside a new song, faint but still recognizable if we listen closely. Now let us pause on the limits of what we know. Ancient DNA is fragile. It decays quickly in heat and moisture, surviving best in cold caves or permafrost. This means our picture is uneven. Whole regions of the world may have held other humans, but their traces in DNA are invisible to us now, washed away by time. Even in modern genomes, detecting ancient signals is difficult. We find fragments, but they do not tell us what the whole being looked like, how tall they were, or what their lives were like. We can only guess from patterns, and we must be careful not to confuse possibility with proof. The language of traces here is mathematical. Scientists compare genomes across populations, looking for stretches of DNA that stand out as different, older, or unusual. These stretches act like fingerprints, markers of contact with vanished group. One striking example is found in people of the Tibetan Plateau, where a gene variant helps the body adapt to thin air. This variant came not from modern humans but from Denisovans. It is a quiet sign of how a lost lineage still shapes life today. Let us rest for a while in a thought experiment. Imagine that among the many vanished branches of humanity, there was one that tended to grow taller than the rest. Perhaps they lived in forests where height gave advantage, or in plains where strength was needed. Over time, they encountered our ancestors. Some children were born from those meetings. Most of their lineage faded, but fragments of their genes remained in us. Thousands of years later, we notice a recurring pattern. Certain genetic markers associated with growth, scattered in different populations. If we looked only at bones, we might see nothing. If we looked only at myths, we might doubt. But if we looked at genes, we might find faint signals pointing back toward a people remembered in story as giant. Before moving further, we can pause on a softer observation. DNA does not give us clear images. It is not like a painting, but more like a set of numbers hinting at shape. We can measure, compare, and model, but the picture always remains incomplete. Still, these signals remind us that absence of fossils does not mean absence of kin. The body itself carries the archive, waiting for us to learn how to read it. And so we close gently with an open thought. The genetic traces we carry remind us that our history is shared, interwoven, and far larger than what bones alone can tell. Whether giants once lived as a distinct people, or whether tall individuals simply left their echo in both genes and stories, remains uncertain. What is certain is that the code within us holds memory, a quiet continuity of lineages that fade from sight but not from existence, shaping us still in ways we are only beginning to understand. What if the shifting rhythms of climate shaped not only landscapes and animals but also the forms of humans who lived within them? Our bodies do not exist outside the environment. They adapt, slowly and subtly, to the pressures around them. In warm, fertile valleys, smaller frames may thrive with less need for reserve. On open plains or in colder heights, larger bodies may offer advantages of strength or resilience. The possibility that entire human groups once grew taller than others can be thought of in this quiet context, as one of many responses to changing conditions. The scale here is deep. Across hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth has moved through ice ages and warm periods, each leaving its mark in soil, in seas, and in the living beings of the time. When glaciers advanced, forests shrank and grasslands spread. When warmth returned, rivers swelled, trees spread again, and with them new opportunities for food and shelter. Each shift altered what it meant to survive. The process of adaptation is gradual, measured in generations. Traits that support survival become more common, while those less suited fade. This is the rhythm of natural selection, not fast, not sudden, but steady as a tide. And just as animals grew larger or smaller depending on their surroundings, humans too may have followed paths shaped by climate's hand. Let us pause a moment on the limits of this knowledge. We cannot map precisely how climate shaped every human form. The record is patchy. Fossils are rare, genetic signals incomplete, archaeological sites scattered. Sometimes we can see clear patterns. In colder regions, shorter, sturdier frames appear. In warmer regions, taller, leaner forms. But between these points are vast silences. We cannot say with confidence whether a distinct lineage of tall humans once arose in response to particular conditions. The possibility remains open, neither proven nor disproven. Still, climate leaves traces we can read. Ice cores preserve bubbles of ancient air, showing us how temperatures rose and fell. Layers of sediment record shifts in vegetation, pollen grains revealing which plants thrive. Bones of animals, preserved in caves, show changes in size and diet, reflecting the world around them. These indirect signals tell us of pressures that would also have touched human bodies. If myths of giants echo real memories, perhaps those beings flourished in one such window, adapted to conditions we can only glimpse through these traces. Now let us try a thought experiment. Imagine a time when cooler climates spread across a region. Food was abundant but required long journeys to gather, herds moving far, forests thinning. A taller frame, with longer stride and greater strength, might have offered advantage. Over many generations, such traits became common in one community. For a time, they lived in balance with their environment. But climates shifted again. Forests returned, resources changed, and their size, once useful, became costly. Energy needs grew harder to meet. Slowly, their numbers dwindled. Some mingled with neighboring groups, leaving faint echoes of height in the genetic record. Others faded entirely. Thousands of years later, no bones remain, only layers of soil showing the changes of forest and grassland, and stories among neighbors of a tall people who once walked there. Before moving further, let us rest on a simple observation. Climate is an artist with a broad brush. It shapes mountains, rivers, animals, and us. Yet it does not carve in stone. It works with chance, with adaptation, with loss. This is why its mark on humanity is subtle, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden. Giants, if they ever lived, may have been one of its temporary experiments, a form suited to one moment, unsuited to the next. And so we close with a gentle pause. Climate reminds us that nothing is fixed, not even the shape of humans. The absence of tall bones does not mean tall humans never were. It means only that the Earth has not yet offered us their remains. Until it does, the possibility rests quietly, between science and story, held in balance by the patience of time. What if tools, those quiet companions of human hands, are themselves witnesses to forms we no longer see? Stone axes, blades, carvings, and shelters are more enduring than flesh. They remain when bones have dissolved, when words have faded, when the memory of faces has slipped into silence. If there were once humans taller than the rest, their presence might not be written only in skeletons, but in the scale of what they built and used. The context of tools is broad and patient. Across continents, we find hand axes the size of palms, scrapers shaped for precise work, and hammers heavy enough to demand unusual strength. Most fit comfortably within the range of ordinary human use. Yet, every so often, objects appear that seem oversized, as though intended for hands larger than we expect. Some may simply reflect choice. Heavier tools can break stone more quickly. But some may hint, however faintly, at makers whose frames were different from ours. The mechanism is simple to understand. Tools are shaped by need, but also by the body that holds them. A handle too wide or a stone too heavy cannot serve its purpose. In archaeology, this link between tool and hand is used cautiously, yet it is real. We measure wear marks, angles, the balance of weight. These signals tell us about the users, though never with perfect clarity. If a community of taller humans once existed, Their tools might reflect their strength or reach, leaving us indirect traces of their scale. Now let us pause on what we do not know. Tools are deceptive. A large axe may not require a large hand. It may only require cooperation, with one person holding, another striking. A wide spearhead may not mean a taller hunter, but a different prey. The interpretations multiply and certainty retreat. This is why archaeology speaks in probabilities, not absolute. The silence of context, who used a tool, how it was held, cannot be fully bridged. Still, tools form an archive, and their language can be read. Layers of soil preserve them like punctuation marks in forgotten sentences. By comparing sites, we notice patterns. Sudden shifts in size, changes in shape, new kinds of wear. These may reflect cultural choice, but they may also reflect the presence of different bodies shaping their world in slightly different ways. Now let us try a thought experiment. Imagine a river valley where a community of tall humans lived. Their strength allowed them to fashion larger axes, useful for felling thicker trees. Their spears, longer and heavier, suited their reach. For centuries they lived in rhythm with their tools. But climate shifted, or neighbors arrived, and their lineage dwindled. The valley filled with new people, smaller in frame, who found these tools awkward. They left them behind, scattered in layers of sediment. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover them. To our eyes, they seem oversized, unusual, out of place. Without bones, without context, we hesitate. Were they ceremonial, experimental, or were they simply practical for hands that no longer exist? Before moving further, let us rest with another thought. Tools endure because stone resists decay. They outlast the beings who made them, silent markers of hands long gone. In their shapes, we sense presence, but not certainty. If giants once walked among us, perhaps their truest remains are not bones but the heavy tools that only they could wield with ease. And so we close softly. The study of tools cannot confirm giants, nor can it deny them. What it offers are fragments, objects heavier than average, larger than needed, sometimes puzzling in scale. These fragments may be nothing more than choices of style or utility. Or they may be the faintest echoes of bodies taller than ours, hands stronger, lives adapted to a different balance. In either case, the tools remain, waiting in the earth, reminding us that even without bones, the past can speak through the weight of what was shaped and left behind. What if the great works of stone, the walls, the towers, the monuments that rise above the earth, were not only testaments to collective effort but also quiet reminders of hands and bodies different from our own? Legends often link giants to these structures, saying that it was they who placed the stones too heavy for ordinary humans, that it was they who lifted blocks into walls or carved pillars to the sky. We cannot take these claims as direct evidence, but we can pause with the thought that memory, when faced with extraordinary scale, often seeks extraordinary makers. The context for this is vast. Across the world, we see ruins of great weight. The Cyclopean walls of Greece, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, the megaliths of Stonehenge, the terraces of the Andes. Each site carries stones larger than seems practical. Today we explain them through patient work, through teams, through tools and clever method. Yet for those who lived closer to the time of their making, these constructions may have felt beyond the ordinary, prompting stories of beings larger than life. The mechanism of storytelling here is clear. When human effort creates something that surpasses easy understanding, myth often provides an answer. Giants, in this sense, may have been symbolic builders, embodiments of strength used to explain the unexplained. But we must also remember that myths can preserve fragments of memory, and the possibility, however faint, remains that some tales of builders might echo encounters with people whose scale seemed unusual. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Archaeology offers us stones, alignments, and traces of tools, but it does not tell us with certainty who lifted each block or how tall they stood. Written records are often centuries younger than the structures themselves, shaped as much by imagination as by observation. oral traditions, passed forward, magnify difference into legend. This limitation reminds us to move gently, without rushing to conclusions. The language of traces here lies in the stones themselves. We measure chisel marks, study transport routes, examine quarries. We find that great stones can be moved with levers, with ropes, with determination spread across many hands. Still, there remain puzzles. Blocks weighing dozens of tons placed with precision, terraces laid on mountainside. These puzzles do not demand giants, but they do explain why stories of giants persisted. They are indirect markers of awe, preserved not in bones but in architecture. Let us rest for a while with a thought experiment. Imagine a community where some people were indeed taller, stronger than their neighbors. To them, lifting heavier stones or shaping larger blocks was possible, though demanding. They worked alongside smaller kin, together building structures of unusual scale. Generations later, the memory of tall workers remained, but details blurred. Their descendants, no longer of such stature, looked upon the vast stones with wonder and explained them through story. It must have been giants. As centuries turned to millennia, the story outlasted the memory, and the giants became myth. Before moving further, let us note a softer truth. Even without giants, human cooperation can achieve what seems impossible. Many hands, over much time, can move mountains or at least shape them. But myths of giant builders may reflect more than admiration for teamwork. They may also reflect deep impressions left by difference, by encounters with people who stood apart in scale. And so we close gently, with both possibilities resting side by side. The great works of stone may be monuments not only of human ingenuity but also of memory, reshaped into myth. Whether giants were real builders or symbolic ones, we cannot say with certainty. What remains is the awareness that size, whether of stones or of beings, has always drawn us to story, and that these stories, like the walls themselves, endure long after their makers are gone. What if language itself carries fossils, not of bone or stone, but of meaning? Words, like rivers, carve channels through time, reshaping yet still carrying fragments of their origins. In many tongues, the word for giant is not only about height. It touches on ancestry, on forefathers, on beings who stand apart from ordinary people. This overlap may not be coincidence. It may suggest that when communities remembered their tall ones, they also remembered them as those who came before, shaping the world for those who followed. The context here is wide and layered. Languages change slowly, over centuries, shifting sounds and meanings. A word that once described stature may come to mean greatness of spirit. A term for ancestor may stretch to mean one who was larger, stronger, or more powerful. These shifts leave echoes we can trace in old writings, in oral stories, in etymologies, the study of how words evolve. In this way, words themselves become quiet archives, preserving not exact memories but hints of older associations. The process is simple to imagine. When a community speaks of a forefather, it may also wish to convey respect. To call them giant is to place them above ordinary scale, both physically and in memory. Over time, the distinction between metaphor and literal description blurs. Were they truly taller or simply greater in reputation? The word holds both meanings, and we are left unable to separate them. Now we pause on what we cannot know. Language rarely gives us precise record. Meanings shift, metaphors harden, translations alter. A single word may carry centuries of change, leaving us uncertain which layer reflects lived reality and which is poetic imagination. This is why reading the language of giants demands care. We cannot assume that old texts meant physical size, but neither can we dismiss the possibility that the metaphor was rooted in experience. The language of traces here lies in patterns. Across cultures, we see the same overlap. The great ancestor described as giant, the giant remembered as forefather. In Greek, in Norse, in Semitic traditions, in African oral poetry, this linking appears. As in statistics, when separate data points cluster, we pay attention. The repetition may be coincidence, or it may hint at a deeper root. The memory of meeting others taller or stronger, absorbed into the words for those who came before. Let us rest now with a thought experiment. Imagine a community that once lived beside another, taller group. The taller ones eventually disappeared, but memory of them remained. Generations later, when people spoke of their ancestors, they pictured not only their own forebears but also those tall figures who once shared their world. The word for ancestor began to carry that weight. As centuries passed, the literal memory faded, but the word endured, carrying both meanings forward. When myths were told, the giants were at once ancestors and symbols of greatness. This blending left its mark in language, even when the bodies themselves were long gone. Before moving further, let us linger on a simple truth. Language is both fragile and resilient. It forgets details, yet preserves associations. It does not give us measurements, yet it whispers of impressions that mattered enough to survive. Giants in language may be symbols only, or they may be faint reminders of a real difference once seen. We cannot draw a hard line. What we can do is listen to words as we would to echoes, aware that they bend, but that they still carry sound. And so we close softly. The overlap of giant and ancestor in language reminds us how humans remember, through metaphor, through reverence, through words stretched across centuries. Whether giants were ever real in flesh, or only in speech, remains uncertain. But the words themselves stand as quiet witnesses, preserving the idea of beings larger than us, rooted deeply in the soil of memory, carried gently in the flowing river of language. What if the widespread presence of giants in myth, appearing in places far apart, points less to coincidence and more to a shared memory of difference? When we pause to notice the breadth of this motif, we see it in the sagas of the North, in the tales of the Pacific Islands, in the traditions of Africa, in the folklore of the Americas. Each culture tells its stories in its own voice, shaped by local landscapes and histories, yet the figure of the giant returns again and again. This repetition is like a rhythm in music, recognizable even when the instruments are different. The context stretches across continents and centuries. Human communities have always told stories to make sense of the world. They described the great animals they hunted, the forces of the sky and sea, and the neighbors they met. Sometimes those neighbors were so different in appearance or in stature that they seemed set apart. Over time, memory blurred and myth expanded, but the central image, of people taller, stronger, beyond ordinary scale, remained. This is why we encounter giants almost everywhere, even where cultures were separated by oceans. The mechanism that spreads these stories is rooted in the human tendency to magnify what is striking. A tall individual, in a population of smaller frame, can inspire a tale that grows with each telling. When such tales exist in many regions, they converge into a global motif. The question is whether this convergence reflects a universal imagination, or whether it carries echoes of real encounters with other human forms now gone. We cannot be certain. Now we pause for a moment on the limits of our knowledge. Comparative mythology allows us to map similarities, but it cannot always explain them. Shared stories may come from contact, from migration, or simply from the universality of human thought. We cannot always distinguish between invention and memory. And because myths change over time, we cannot trace a direct line from the image of a giant to a historical reality. The overlap suggests significance, but the meaning remains open. The language of traces here is cultural rather than material. When we place myths side by side, we notice clusters. Stories of giants as builders, as guardians, as threats. Some speak of them as wise, others as dangerous, others still as tragic. These clusters act like markers, showing us how deeply the image of the giant was embedded in the human imagination. The persistence itself is a kind of data. If nothing else, it tells us that size, whether real or remembered, left an impression strong enough to cross time and geography. Let us rest now with a thought experiment. Imagine that thousands of years ago, several regions were home to populations taller than others. Each region left behind neighbors who remembered them. These neighbors, through story, carried the memory forward. When separated communities across the globe created their myths, they each shaped the figure of the giant, not from direct contact with one another, but from their own local impressions. Later, when we look back, the pattern seems universal. Another possibility is gentler still. Perhaps giants are simply the natural product of imagination, a way to embody strength and difference. Children, after all, see adults as giants, and communities may see outsiders as larger than life. If so, then the universality of giants reflects a universality of perception, not of history. Now, before moving further, let us note something simple. In both cases, whether rooted in memory of tall humans or in the human tendency to magnify difference, the stories converge. They tell us that height, real or imagined, mattered. It was enough to shape myths across time, across oceans, across languages. And so we close with quiet recognition. Comparative myths cannot prove that giants once lived, nor can they prove they did not. What they show us is that the idea of giants, whether born of encounters or of imagination, is one of the oldest and most persistent threads in human storytelling. It endures because it speaks to something universal, the sense of being small before forces greater than ourselves, whether in nature, in others, or in memory. What if encounters with others, taller or different in form, left not only myths but also faint imprints in our collective memory of migration? Human history is a long story of movement, groups leaving valleys, crossing rivers, following herds, and meeting those who were already there. Each meeting shaped both sides, not only through trade or conflict, but also through impression. To see people who looked familiar yet stood taller, or whose strength seemed unusual, may have been enough to plant the seeds of legends that endured long after the meetings ended. The context of migration is vast. Over tens of thousands of years, humans moved out of Africa, spreading into Europe, Asia, and eventually across oceans. Along the way, they met Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others we have yet to identify. These encounters left genetic traces in our DNA, proof that mingling occurred. But beyond the genetic record, there may have been memories preserved in story. Oral traditions often serve as quiet archives, capturing the strangeness of the unfamiliar and reshaping it into forms that communities could hold in mind. Giants may be one such reshaping, a way of remembering neighbors who seemed beyond ordinary scale. The mechanism here is simple but powerful. When a small group meets a larger-bodied one, the difference stands out. Over generations, the memory of that difference persists, but the details blur. As the smaller group moves on, or as the taller group disappears, the memory transforms. The tall ones are no longer neighbors but giants of an earlier age, tied to the land itself. In this way, migrations may have scattered not only people but also the seeds of giant myths, carried into new regions and retold in new voices. Let us pause for a moment on what we cannot know. Archaeology shows us movement through tools, through campsites, through layers of habitation. Genetics shows us traces of contact. But the lived experience, the awe, the fear, the stories told at firesides, remains invisible. We cannot measure the height of those remembered in myth, nor separate literal memory from symbolic expression. The limits remind us that absence of clear evidence does not settle the question. The language of traces here is both genetic and cultural. Genetic studies reveal fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA within us, markers of meetings long ago. Cultural studies reveal parallel stories of giants across lands separated by oceans. Taken together, they hint at a pattern. Encounters occurred, and they left more than physical traces. They left impressions strong enough to echo in myth. The pattern itself is a kind of indirect evidence, though never complete. Now let us rest with a thought experiment. Imagine a band of early humans migrating into a new valley. There they meet others, taller, broader, with unfamiliar features. For a time, they share space, perhaps exchange tools, perhaps form families. Then, over centuries, the taller group dwindles and disappears. The migrants remain, carrying their memory. When they move on again, they take the story with them. As generations pass, the story grows. The tall neighbors become giants. The giants become part of the land, said to have built the hills or shaped the rivers. Eventually, the descendants no longer know the origin of the story, only that giants once were. This imagined chain shows how memory of migration could harden into myth. Before we move further, let us note something gentle. Human history is filled with encounters, some recorded in bones, others in genes, others only in words. Giants may be one way of remembering encounters with people who stood apart in size or strength. Or they may be pure imagination, born of the human tendency to magnify difference. We cannot decide with finality. And so we close softly. Migration reminds us that humans have always been travelers, carrying not only tools and families, but also memories and stories. Whether giants were ever real companions on those journeys, or only symbolic figures created from the feeling of difference, remains uncertain. What endures is the awareness that movement and meeting shaped us, and that, in the quiet spaces of story, those meetings still live. What if the sudden vanishings of entire human groups, the quiet extinctions that left only fragments behind, are the hidden roots of the stories of giants? We know that in deep time, not all branches of our family tree survived. Neanderthals disappeared, Denisovans too, and perhaps others whose names we will never know. Extinction is not an exception in nature, it is its rhythm. Yet for those who witnessed the final days of these groups, the memory may have been carried forward, reshaped into tale. Giants may be echoes of neighbors who lived, then dwindled, then were remembered as beings of another age. The context of extinction stretches across millennia. Climate shifts, diseases, competition, and interbreeding, all are forces that can thin a population until it no longer continues as its own. Sometimes extinction is sudden, like fire sweeping through a forest. Sometimes it is slow, like sand slipping from a vessel, grain by grain. Humans would have seen such endings at close hand, even if they did not know the word extinction. They would have seen groups vanish from valleys, caves left empty, hunters who did not return. The image of those who were different, whether taller, stronger, or simply other, may have lingered longer than their presence. The mechanism here is not complicated. When one group fades, the survivors carry the memory. At first it is recollection, told in detail. Who they were, what they looked like, where they lived. With time, the detail blurs, and the memory becomes story. Story becomes myth. Myth becomes legend of giants, of beings larger than life, who once walked the earth. It is a natural transformation, one that allows memory to survive even as clarity is lost. Now let us pause for a moment on the limits of our knowing. Extinction leaves traces in fossils and in genetics, but not in the human perception of what it felt like to watch neighbors disappear. We cannot reach into the minds of those who told the first stories. We cannot separate what was observation from what was imagination. And so we remain cautious, aware that absence of proof is not proof of absence, but also that memory is never precise. The language of traces here comes in several forms. In bones, we see sudden endings, species present in one layer gone in the next. In DNA, we see signals of lineages absorbed into ours, their independent identity lost but their fragments carried forward. In archaeology, we see breaks in traditions, a tool style ending, a settlement pattern fading. These signals remind us that extinction is visible in the record, even if the lived story of how it was perceived is not. Let us rest now with a thought experiment. Imagine a valley where a tall people lived for centuries, side by side with smaller neighbors. For a time, both groups thrived. But climate changed, food grew scarce, and the tall people dwindled. Some intermarried, some perished, and soon their presence was no longer seen. The smaller neighbors, looking back, remembered them as impressive, as different. The stories told around fires grew with time, describing not only their height but also their strength, their building, their wisdom. Centuries later, when bones were gone and memory was blurred, the tall people were remembered only as giants. Another possibility is gentler still. Perhaps extinction was not total. Perhaps fragments of those groups lived on in others, absorbed slowly until their distinctness was lost. In such a case, the memory of giants would not be of strangers entirely gone, but of ancestors partly within us. We would carry their blood, even as we turned their memory into legend. Before moving further, let us note a quiet truth. To us, extinction may sound final, but in the flow of time, it is part of continuity. One branch ends, another continues, sometimes carrying fragments of what was lost. Stories may preserve what fossils cannot. The feeling of difference, the impression of scale. Giants, in this sense, may be both memory and metaphor, both echo and invention. And so we close with gentleness. Extinctions have shaped the world we know, but the way they were remembered is harder to trace. Giants may stand at that boundary, between what was seen and what was imagined, between beings who once walked and the stories that outlived them. Whether they were real or symbolic, they remind us of the fragile balance of presence and absence, and of how memory transforms endings into myths that still travel with us across the ages. What if the idea of giants was not always about height alone, but also about strength, endurance, and presence, magnified by the conditions of the natural world? Ancient people lived close to landscapes that dwarfed them, mountains, forests, seas. To feel small before these forces was natural. Yet sometimes, stories speak not of mountains or storms, but of beings whose bodies seem to carry a similar vastness. We may wonder if tales of giants are reflections of environments, of the way humans translated the immensity of nature into human form. The context of perception is important. In a time without machines, without tall buildings, even the work of moving great stones or enduring the cold could appear superhuman. When a person stronger than others was seen lifting weight, walking great distances, or hunting large animals, the impression may have been exaggerated by awe. The line between remarkable human and mythical giant is thin when viewed through memory and story. This blending shows how natural forces and human variation might have merged in imagination. The mechanism of perception follows simple step. First, difference is noticed. Someone taller, someone stronger. Then, that difference is told in story, magnified by comparison with ordinary life. Finally, the story is retold across generations, polished until the difference becomes something more than human. In this process, the giant may not have been a separate species, but a way of expressing what felt immense, powerful, or enduring. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Archaeology shows us tools and bones, but it cannot capture perception, the feeling of standing beside someone larger, or watching strength expressed in ways beyond the ordinary. Mythology shows us patterns, but it does not distinguish between literal memory and symbolic metaphor. We are left with fragments of both, without a clear path to separate them. This is why we move gently, acknowledging possibility but resisting certainty. The language of traces here is cultural and environmental. In stories, giants often appear linked to mountains, caves, or great stones, as though their image was fused with the scale of the land itself. In traditions from the Andes to the Himalayas, the great ones are tied to peaks, to heights, to landscapes that echo their form. This suggests that giants may be a way of humanizing vastness, of making sense of environments that inspired both fear and reverence. Let us rest a moment in a thought experiment. Imagine a valley where the mountains rise steeply, casting shadows across villages. Among the people there is one family, taller and stronger than the rest, shaped by generations of good diet and strong bones. They hunt game that others cannot, carry stones that others leave. Their deeds are told at night around fires, and their figures become tied to the peaks that overlook the valley. Over centuries, when the family is gone, the stories remain. The tall ones are no longer just remembered as neighbors but as beings shaped like the mountains themselves. They become giants in story, their human origins forgotten. Now we pause again, because the connection between environment and imagination is subtle. Humans often make sense of immensity by giving it form. Storms become gods, rivers become spirits, and mountains become the homes of giants. This does not prove that giants walk the earth, but it does explain why they appear so often in places where landscapes dominate human life. And so we close gently with both possibilities in balance. Giants may have been real people, remembered through story, or they may have been metaphors, embodiments of the vastness that surrounded ancient communities. Either way, they remind us of the human need to give shape to what feels larger than ourselves, to translate awe into story, and to carry that story across generations as quietly as mountains hold their shadows. What if the traces of giants are not to be sought in bones or tools alone, but also in the quiet realm of ritual and burial? Across the earth, we find tombs, cairns, and megalithic chambers that seem scaled beyond the needs of ordinary bodies. Some contain remains that match our own stature, yet the architecture itself feels outsized, as though designed for people larger than us. Stories often follow these places, saying they were made by or for giants. While we cannot take such legends literally, the persistence of the association asks us to pause and consider. The context of burial traditions is long and varied. For tens of thousands of years, humans have buried their dead with care, marking graves with stones, offerings, or earth mounds. Burial is both practical and symbolic, a way to honor life and to preserve memory. The size of a tomb does not always reflect the size of the person. It may reflect status, wealth, or belief. Yet, when structures are repeatedly larger than function requires, questions arise. Were they symbolic of greatness, or echoes of an older memory of those who truly were larger? The mechanism is familiar. Architecture speaks not only of need but of imagination. A large tomb may be built to magnify the presence of the one within, just as a tall monument magnifies the memory of a ruler. But it may also reflect adaptation to physical form. If a lineage of taller people existed, their burial chambers may have been built accordingly. Later generations, encountering these oversized structures, might have interpreted them as belonging to giants, even if the bones were no longer present. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Erosion, looting, and time erase much of the record. Many tombs are empty, their original occupants lost. Myths that attach to them may be later inventions, not direct memories. We cannot separate with confidence which oversized structures reflect symbolic grandeur and which reflect physical necessity. This uncertainty cautions us to move gently, holding both possibilities in balance. The language of traces here includes dimensions, alignments, and the artifacts left within. Archaeologists measure chamber heights, doorway widths, and stone weight. They compare these to ordinary human proportions. When the fit seems too wide, too tall, the anomaly stands out. Some explain it through ritual need. Chambers built large to hold ceremonies, not just bodies. Others suggest they may have been shaped to reflect beings remembered as taller than the rest. The data does not decide for us. It only shows the scale. Let us rest for a moment with a thought experiment. Imagine a coastal community where tall people lived. Their burials required larger chambers, and so they built them from massive stones. Generations later, their lineage declined, and smaller people inherited the land. To them, the great tombs seemed mysterious, too large for their own frames. They explained them in story, saying they had been built by giants. The bones within slowly decayed, but the stones endured. Thousands of years later, archaeologists measure them, puzzled by their scale, while myths of giants continue to cling to the place. Another possibility is subtler. Perhaps oversized tombs were always symbolic, built to honor memory rather than to match physical size. Yet even in that case, the myth of giants attaches itself naturally, for humans often link size with power. The two possibilities intertwine until we can no longer tell them apart. Before we move further, let us pause on the quiet durability of stone. Bones dissolve, wood rots, but stone endures. In this endurance, it holds impressions of scale, impressions that later become part of story. If giants were ever real, their tombs may be among the few structures that could still whisper of them. If they were never real, the tombs still serve as reminders of how humans imagine greatness in size. And so we close gently. Burial traditions remind us that memory is built not only in words but in stone. Whether giants once lay in larger tombs or whether the tombs themselves created the image of giants remains uncertain. What is certain is that these places carry weight, both physical and symbolic, and that they continue to shape the stories we tell about the beings who came before us. What if ancient art, painted on stone or carved into it, holds not just symbols but quiet hints of how people saw themselves and those around them? Caves, cliffs, and tablets often preserve figures larger than others, beings drawn with exaggerated height or presence. Some scholars read these images as gods or spirits, others as metaphors for power. But it is also possible that some of these figures were inspired by real encounters with people who stood taller, remembered not through bones but through lines of pigment and grooves of stone. The context of early art is wide and layered. From the painted walls of Europe to the rock carvings of Africa and Asia, humans expressed what mattered most to them: animals, hunts, rituals, and figures that stood apart. These images were not casual sketches. They were deliberate, repeated, and often placed in sacred spaces. Their scale carries meaning. When one figure is drawn taller than the rest, it signals importance, but it may also reflect physical difference. The mechanism of exaggeration is simple. Artists enlarge what they want to emphasize. A hunter becomes bigger than his prey. A leader towers over companions. A spirit looms over worshippers. This is a universal language of art. Yet, when we see repeated depictions of unusually tall human-like figures, we cannot rule out that they were inspired by people who truly appeared larger than the norm. In this way, art becomes both metaphor and possible memory. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Pigment fades, carvings erode, and context is lost. We rarely know who the figures represent, or how the makers understood them. Later interpretations may add layers of meaning that were never intended. The distance of time blurs certainty. This is why we must be cautious, acknowledging both the symbolic and the literal without collapsing one into the other. The language of traces here lies in proportion. Archaeologists measure the relative size of figures, noting when humans are drawn larger than animals or smaller than them. Statistical patterns show whether the difference is symbolic or consistent. When large human-like forms appear again and again, alongside ordinary figures, the anomaly invites reflection. It may be myth, or it may be echo. The data does not resolve the tension, but it keeps the question alive. Let us rest a moment in a thought experiment. Imagine a community that occasionally met taller strangers from neighboring valleys. These visitors left an impression, their size retold in story and reinforced in image. The artists of the community painted them larger, not only to show respect but also to capture the difference that memory could not forget. Centuries later, the people who made those paintings were gone, but the images remained. Without context, later generations saw only giant figures, and the stories around them grew. In this way, art that began as memory became legend, and legend became myth. Another step in thought leads us to a gentler explanation. Perhaps the tall figures were never real, but symbols of importance, of roles larger than ordinary life. Yet the persistence of the image across regions still tells us something. Humans everywhere were drawn to depict larger beings, whether real or imagined. That universality is itself a marker, a signal worth holding gently in mind. Before moving further, let us note the quiet endurance of art. Unlike words, which fade, or bones, which decay, pigments sealed in caves and carvings in stone can last tens of thousands of years. They are fragments of thought, frozen in time. If giants once walked among us, these images may be the closest thing to portraits they left. If they did not, the images still reveal how humans imagined beings greater than themselves. And so we close softly, with both paths open. Ancient art cannot prove giants lived, nor can it prove they did not. What it shows is that the idea of larger beings was important enough to be painted on stone, carved into walls, and carried across millennia. Whether as memory or as metaphor, those figures still stand silently, watching us as we watch them, across the long sleep of time. What if the echoes of giants are hidden not in visible monuments but in the subtle rhythm of oral traditions, stories carried by voice long before they were written down? For much of human history, memory was not preserved on paper but in speech, repeated by elders to children, reshaped with each telling yet anchored by familiar patterns. Oral traditions are not static. They are like rivers, flowing and adjusting to the land they cross. Yet within their flow they preserve sediments of older times, fragments of encounters or impressions that might otherwise have been lost. Giants often appear in these traditions, described not in precise measurements but in qualities: strength, size, endurance, strangeness. The context here is immense. Across continents, cultures separated by oceans and mountains developed their own stories, yet many included figures larger than ordinary humans. In the Pacific Islands, tales tell of long-legged ancestors. In Africa, traditions speak of ancient tall ones who walked before current peoples. In the Americas, native stories recall battles with giants or marriages between giants and ordinary humans. The variety is wide, but the theme is shared. Oral tradition can travel across thousands of years, changing form but keeping its kernel alive. The mechanism of oral memory works through repetition and ritual. Important stories are tied to songs, rhythms, or ceremonies, making them easier to recall. These elements act like anchors, holding the memory steady even as details shift. When a community encounters something unusual, whether a stranger of unusual height or an event beyond ordinary scale, it may weave it into story, ensuring it is not forgotten. Over centuries, the story becomes less report and more myth, but the seed of memory may still remain. Now let us pause gently on what we cannot know. Oral traditions are layered with metaphor, and we cannot always tell which parts reflect lived experience and which reflect imagination. A giant in story may mean a tall neighbor, or it may mean a powerful ancestor, or it may simply symbolize forces greater than oneself. Without written records, we cannot fix the meaning. All we can do is notice patterns and respect their persistence. The language of traces here is cultural resonance. When similar motifs arise independently across distant peoples, they form a pattern worth noting. Anthropologists map these motifs much as geologists map layers, seeing where they overlap and where they diverge. Giants appear in too many layers, across too many regions, to be dismissed entirely as coincidence. The recurrence is itself a kind of marker, showing us how deeply the image of great beings was woven into the human imagination. Let us pause for a thought experiment. Imagine a small group of humans living near a taller lineage. For generations, they see them at a distance, sometimes trading, sometimes conflicting. Eventually, the taller group vanishes, whether through climate, migration, or decline. Yet the memory remains. Elders tell children about the tall neighbors, warning them or admiring them. The children pass the story forward. Centuries later, when bones are gone and detail forgotten, the story has grown into legend of giants who once walked the land. The literal memory has dissolved, but the impression has endured. Another possibility is quieter. Perhaps no tall lineage ever lived there, but stories of giants arose as metaphors for mountains, storms, or ancestors. Yet because oral tradition is flexible, it allowed communities to weave those metaphors into human form. Over time, The figure of the giant became a shared language for expressing difference, awe, and memory of what is larger than ordinary life. Before we move further, let us note a gentle truth. Oral traditions are not archives in the sense of fixed records, they are living currents. They do not preserve precise data, but they preserve feeling, impression, importance. In that sense, they may carry something that bones and stones cannot, the memory of how things once felt, of how others once appeared. And so we close softly. Oral traditions remind us that human memory is not only material but spoken, sung, and remembered in rhythm. Whether giants were ever real or only imagined, their presence in these stories tells us they mattered, enough to be carried for centuries by voice alone. They remind us that absence of physical proof does not erase the weight of cultural memory, and that sometimes, in the quiet persistence of a story, we glimpse echoes of encounters long past. What if myths of giants are not only reflections of memory or imagination, but also quiet mirrors of social tensions, a way of speaking about difference and distance between communities? When one group appears stronger, taller, or more powerful than another, the impression may become larger than life. Over time, the memory of that imbalance may be told as if one side were giants and the other ordinary humans. In this way, giants can stand not just for physical size, but also for the weight of social difference. The context is wide. Across human history, communities have often lived side by side with others who were different in appearance, in language, in customs, in resources. Encounters could lead to exchange, to cooperation, or to conflict. In such meetings, exaggeration easily arises. A rival becomes more fearsome in story. An ally becomes more impressive in song. Height and strength are simple measures to magnify, easy to carry in memory. And once spoken of in such terms, the image takes on a life of its own, long after the real differences have blurred. The mechanism is simple. Social boundaries create contrast. When people see others as separate, they often translate that difference into metaphors of scale. A tall stranger becomes a giant. A group with strength in battle becomes remembered as larger than life. As generations pass, the metaphor detaches from its source and becomes myth. The giant is no longer just the neighbor. It is now a being of another order, set apart from ordinary humanity. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Stories told by victors often shape the record. If a smaller group told tales of taller rivals, the exaggeration may have survived longer than the truth. If a dominant group spoke of itself as descended from giants, it may have used scale as a symbol of legitimacy. In either case, the literal detail of size is hidden behind the layers of meaning. We cannot peel them back with certainty. The language of traces here lies in mythic roles. Giants are often described as the others, beings at the edge of the world, enemies of gods or heroes, sometimes ancestors who must be defeated or integrated. These roles reflect social dynamics: outsiders, rivals, predecessors. By mapping these roles across cultures, we see patterns of how societies expressed difference. Giants may not point directly to extinct human species, but they may still preserve echoes of encounters with those who seemed markedly different. Let us pause for a thought experiment. Imagine a small farming community living near a group of tall nomadic hunters. To the farmers, the hunters seem imposing, moving swiftly across the land, carrying heavy weapons. When conflicts arise, the stories told of them grow in scale. They are remembered not just as rivals, but as giants, beings beyond ordinary human measure. Centuries later, when the hunters are gone or absorbed, the stories remain, shaped by memory of social contrast rather than precise detail. Another step in thought brings us to the possibility of inversion. Perhaps the taller group told stories of themselves as giants, not out of fear, but out of pride. To be a giant was to be stronger, closer to gods, worthy of respect. In this way, myths may reflect not only how others were seen, but how groups wished to see themselves. Before moving further, let us note a simple truth. Myths often blend memory with meaning. They do not tell us exactly what happened, but they tell us what mattered. Giants as symbols of the other may reflect real differences, or they may reflect the way communities expressed imbalance and awe. In either case, they give us insight into how humans understood themselves in relation to those around them. And so we close softly. Giants in myth may be literal, or they may be social metaphors, or perhaps both. They remind us that difference, whether of height, strength, or custom, has always left deep impressions. These impressions, retold in story, grew into beings larger than life. Whether they were ever real in flesh or only in perception remains uncertain. What is certain is that the image of giants continues to echo, carrying with it the memory of human encounters with others who stood apart. What if the stories of giants are not only about height or power, but also about time itself, about beings remembered as older, enduring longer than ordinary lives? In many traditions, giants are not just tall, they are ancient, tied to the beginnings of the world, present when rivers formed and mountains rose. This image may reflect not only imagination but also faint echoes of people or groups whose presence stretched across generations, seeming older, more permanent, more rooted in the land than others who came and went. The context of longevity is broad. In earlier times, when average lifespans were short, anyone who lived longer than expected could inspire awe. A person who reached an advanced age, still strong, might be remembered as more than human. Families or lineages that persisted in the same place for centuries, while others migrated or declined, could come to seem timeless, their continuity transformed into myth. Over generations, the impression of age and permanence may have been woven into the idea of giants, beings who were not only larger in body but longer in presence. The mechanism here is gentle and simple. Memory magnifies endurance. When someone stands apart for lasting longer, they seem more than human. In stories, length of life is often expressed through size, as though the two qualities are bound together. To be tall is to be ancient. To be ancient is to be vast. The figure of the giant may thus be a way of expressing the feeling that some people or groups belonged to a deeper layer of time. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Ancient records rarely preserve lifespans with clarity. Bones can sometimes suggest age at death, but they do not tell us how unusual that age was in the context of the time. Oral traditions may exaggerate or compress memory. The claim that giants lived for hundreds of years cannot be taken literally, yet it may preserve the impression of endurance that ordinary lifespans could not match. The language of traces here lies partly in archaeology and partly in mythic cycles. Archaeology shows us layers of habitation, sites where one culture remained for millennia, leaving behind continuous deposits of tools, pottery, and hearths. To later arrivals, such endurance may have been translated into the idea that the earlier people themselves lived longer, almost eternal. Myth confirms this pattern, often describing giants as present from the beginning, as if they belonged to the earth itself. This is another form of indirect evidence, not proof, but resonance. Let us rest for a moment in a thought experiment. Imagine a valley where one lineage remained across centuries, while others passed through and vanished. To outsiders, this lineage seemed as permanent as the mountains, always there, always enduring. When they told stories of the valley, they said, "The tall ones have always been here." Over time, the phrase shifted. The tall ones became giants, beings as old as the rivers. Later still, when the lineage itself was gone, the story remained, stripped of detail but heavy with the impression of timeless presence. Another step in thought takes us to a smaller scale. Imagine a single elder, living twice as long as others, his body still strong while those around him weakened. To children, he seemed immortal, towering in memory if not in body. When they grew older, they told of him as giant, a being who outlasted ordinary time. Memory translated years into height, presence into size. Before we move further, let us pause on the soft link between time and story. Humans have always struggled to grasp deep time, the layers of years beyond individual experience. We often personify it, turning it into figures who embody age, endurance, permanence. Giants may be one such personification, a way of giving form to the sense that some beings, some groups, seemed older, larger, longer lasting than others. And so we close gently. Giants as ancient ones may not reflect real lifespans measured in centuries, but they reflect impressions of endurance, lineages that lasted, elders who outlived their peers, presences that felt timeless. Whether those impressions were of real people or symbolic forms, they remind us that giants are not only about size of body, but also about the scale of time, about beings remembered as part of the deeper rhythm of the earth. What if the traces of giants are hidden not in monuments or myths alone, but in the quiet vocabulary of language itself? Words carry memory in subtle ways. They are passed down, reshaped, and reinterpreted, yet often they preserve echoes of something older than the people who speak them. Many cultures hold ancient terms for giants, tall ones, or great beings, words that appear across distant languages without obvious connection. This recurrence may be coincidence, or it may be a sign that the image of giants was important enough to embed itself into speech, becoming part of daily expression. The context of language is deep. Languages branch and change like trees. Over thousands of years, words evolve, shifting sound and meaning, yet keeping faint traces of their roots. Comparative linguistics, the study of how words travel and transform, lets us glimpse these hidden patterns. When we see repeated clusters of meaning, words for giant or great one tied to stories of beings larger than humans, we can treat them as quiet fossils of thought, carried in language long after their original source was forgotten. The mechanism is simple. When communities speak of something often, the word for it endures. Over time, even if the original referent vanishes, the word remains, floating free, applied to new contexts. A people may once have used a word to describe unusually tall neighbors. Later, when those neighbors are gone, the word survives as giant, a figure of story. The term is passed to descendants, who repeat it without knowing its origin. In this way, language preserves memory invisibly, like a pressed leaf between pages. Now let us pause gently on what we cannot know. Language is slippery. Words change meaning so easily that we cannot always trace them with certainty. A word for giant in one culture may not reflect physical size at all, but greatness of spirit or strength of will. Comparative studies can only go so far. They show us similarities, but they cannot prove the historical experiences behind them. The language of traces here lies in etymology, the study of word origins. Scholars map how terms for giant cluster around roots for big, tall, old, or great. These associations tell us that the figure of the giant was consistently linked to scale and significance. They also show persistence. Words survive longer than stories, carried unconsciously by generations. When we find old terms resurfacing in unexpected places, we glimpse the shadows of forgotten encounters. Let us pause with a thought experiment. Imagine a small community living alongside taller neighbors. They call them by a special word, one that means the great ones. For centuries, they use this term in daily speech. Eventually, the taller neighbors disappear, leaving only memory. The word shifts. Now it means giant, a figure of story. Generations later, the people spread across lands, their language branching into many tongues. The word evolves, changing sound, yet its core meaning remains. Thousands of years later, when scholars compare languages, they notice echoes of the same idea: the great ones, the tall ones, the giants. Another possibility is gentler still. Perhaps no tall neighbors ever lived there, and the word was always metaphor. Even then, its persistence tells us something. It shows that the image of beings larger than life was important enough to anchor itself in language. Words, like stones, can endure longer than flesh, carrying impressions across centuries. Before we move further, let us pause on the quiet durability of speech. Language is not written in layers of rock, yet it behaves like sediment, layering meanings, preserving fragments. Giants may not have left bones in every land, but they left words, whispers of memory that we still carry without noticing. And so we close softly. Giants in language may be fossils of thought, hints of encounters long past, or metaphors that grew roots too deep to vanish. We cannot decide which. What we can notice is that the figure of the giant lives not only in myth and stone, but also in the everyday words we use, reminding us of how the past lingers in the smallest details of human expression. What if the ruins we still see, those great walls, towering stones, and massive platforms, carry not only the mark of human engineering but also the quiet memory of bodies and hands larger than our own? Around the world, there are places where stone blocks weigh far more than what ordinary labor could easily move, where walls rise higher than simple shelter required, where doorways are wider than the shoulders of most who would have walked through them. Many explanations are possible: organization, ingenuity, patience, but alongside them rests the older thought, past in story. These were the works of giants. The context here spans continent. From the highlands of South America to the islands of the Mediterranean, from the deserts of the Near East to the misted hills of northern Europe, massive stone constructions appear. Some are temples, some fortifications, some tombs. They date across millennia, built by different cultures with different purposes. Yet in many cases, later people looked at them and said they could not have been made by ordinary hands. They spoke of giants, being strong enough to lift what now seems immovable. The mechanism of construction can be explained in earthly ways. With levers, with sledges, with coordinated effort, humans can move astonishing weight. With persistence, walls of great scale can rise. But even with such explanations, the impression remains. The sheer size of the stones and the scale of the design give a feeling of excess, as though the builders were measuring against another standard, one not limited by ordinary frames. That feeling, transmitted through time, may have been enough to seed legends of larger beings. Now we pause to consider what we cannot know. The techniques of ancient builders are often lost. Archaeological studies propose methods, but few are certain. The absence of clear records leaves space for imagination, and into that space myths grow. When we hear that a wall is cyclopean or built by giants, we hear both a judgment of scale and an admission of uncertainty. The language of traces here lies in architecture itself. Archaeologists measure the size of stones, the height of walls, the width of entrances. When dimensions exceed practical needs, the anomaly stands out. We can note the statistical difference between typical domestic buildings and monumental ones. The contrast is striking. Ordinary houses are small, but the monuments are immense. Whether this scale reflects symbolic grandeur, ritual significance, or adaptation to larger bodies is not something we can prove. The data shows us the difference, but not the reason. Let us rest now in a thought experiment. Imagine a community of taller people, building with stones proportionate to their bodies. Their walls are wide, their doors high, their tombs vast. To them, this feels natural. Centuries later, when smaller descendants inherit the land, they walk through the doorways and feel small. They look at the walls and feel humbled. They explain the structures not as the work of ancestors like themselves, but as the work of giants. Another possibility is gentler. Perhaps ordinary humans built the walls, but deliberately on a scale that would inspire awe, associating size with sacredness. Later generations, forgetting the intention, read the scale literally, concluding that only beings larger than themselves could have raised such stones. In both paths, myth grows naturally from scale. Before moving further, let us pause on the endurance of stone. While wood decays and metal rusts, stone holds form across thousands of years. It is patient, immovable, carrying impressions of size far beyond the memory of those who built it. When we stand before a massive wall or a giant block, we feel the same awe that ancient people must have felt. That awe needs explanation, and one of the oldest explanations is simple. Giants made this. And so we close gently. Whether the great works of stone were raised by hands like ours or by hands of another scale remains uncertain. What is clear is that they left a lasting impression, one strong enough to carry into story and to endure in language. The ruins remind us of the vastness of human ambition, but also of the possibility that, once, others larger than us walked here too, leaving behind works as enduring as mountains themselves. What if the quiet memory of giants lingers not only in monuments or myths but also in the landscapes themselves, in places named after them, in valleys, hills, and stones said to mark their presence? Across the world, geography carries stories, and many of those stories speak of beings larger than life. A boulder split in two is explained as the seat of a giant. A ridge is called his spine. A river bend becomes the mark of his step. These names and associations last for centuries, long after the original events or imaginings that inspired them have faded. The context of such naming stretches widely. Humans everywhere attach stories to the land. It is how we make sense of features that seem strange, oversized, or difficult to explain. Where glaciers once pushed rocks into fields, later generations said giants had thrown them. Where erosion carved tall columns, people saw the petrified remains of giant bodies. In this way, natural forces left shapes, and those shapes became folded into memory, often through the figure of giants. The mechanism is gentle and familiar. Language ties story to place. Once a hill is called the Hill of Giants, the name endures, even if the story behind it changes or fades. Over centuries, the name becomes a map of cultural memory, holding echoes of impressions that might otherwise vanish. For people living in those places, the presence of giants remains not in bones but in words, spoken whenever the land is named. Now let us pause on what we cannot know. Place names are often older than records, and their origins blur. Scholars try to trace them, but meanings shift with language. A giant stone may once have meant simply great stone. A giant's cave may have referred to size, not to a being. The absence of certainty leaves us in the space between interpretation and silence. The language of traces here is geography itself. Archaeologists and linguists catalog place names, noting how often giants appear. Patterns emerge. Clusters of giant names in regions with unusual rock formations or ancient megalith. These patterns suggest that when people encountered landscapes that felt outsized, they reached for the image of giants to explain them. The land became a kind of archive, carrying the myth forward through its very features. Let us linger in a thought experiment. Imagine a community living near a field of massive boulders left by retreating ice. To them, the stones seem too large to move, too strange to belong. They say giants must have thrown them. The name spreads, the giant stones. Generations later, the ice is forgotten, but the name remains. Children grow up hearing it, picturing being strong enough to hurl mountains. In this way, the land itself preserves the image of giants, long after the true cause is hidden. Another step in thought brings us to human-made landscape. Imagine ancient builders raising enormous standing stones. Their reasons may have been ritual or symbolic, but to later people, the stones seem impossible for ordinary humans. They rename the site, the giant's circle, the giant's grave. The true builders are forgotten, but the myth of giants is fixed, carried in the land's name. Before we move further, let us pause on the endurance of place. Unlike stories, which change with each telling, names remain anchored. They can last through migrations, conquests, and language shift. Even when their meaning is no longer understood, they whisper of old associations. In this way, giants linger not in flesh but in maps, quiet companions to valleys, rivers, and hills. And so we close softly. Landscapes hold memory in their shapes and in their names. Whether giants ever walked them or whether they were only imagined, the land has kept their image alive. Each giant stone or giant's hill is a trace, a reminder of how humans once explained what felt larger than life. These names endure like echoes, quiet signals that link us to those who saw the world before us, and who spoke of beings greater than themselves. What if the faint memory of giants is hidden not only in stories or stones but also in rituals, the quiet movements of hands and voices repeated through centuries? Across cultures, festivals, dances, and rites often preserve images of beings larger than life. We find figures carved from wood, worn as masks, or carried as effigies, giant bodies paraded through streets, towering above the crowd. Such practices may not be literal memory, yet they reveal how the idea of giants continued to live within the rhythm of tradition. Rituals, unlike stories, are embodied. They are not just told but enacted, felt in the body, seen in scale. The context is global. In Europe, medieval festivals carried enormous puppets called giants, symbols of ancient heritage woven into Christian celebrations. In Asia, masks of towering figures appear in dances that mark transitions of season or spirit. In Africa and the Americas, ceremonies once included images of beings with stretched proportions, guardians or challengers beyond ordinary size. Though their meanings shift with time, the persistence of the motif suggests a deep root. Giants belong not only to narrative but to the lived performance of culture. The mechanism is simple but powerful. By acting out the presence of beings larger than ourselves, we give them form again and again. A puppet taller than a house, a mask larger than a face. These exaggerations create a sense of otherness that reinforces memory. Over time, even if the origin is forgotten, the practice survives. Communities repeat it because it feels anchored, because it connects the present to something older. Now we pause to acknowledge limit. Rituals change meaning with each generation. What begins as reverence can become entertainment. What once symbolized ancestors may later symbolize civic pride. Archaeology of ritual is difficult, because movement and performance leave few material traces. Masks may survive, but the gestures and voices do not. We can only interpret, with humility, what the echoes might mean. The language of traces here lies in patterns of representation. When researchers compare ritual artifacts, oversized masks, giant puppets, towering statues, they find recurring themes. These are not precise measurements but impressions of scale. The evidence shows that many societies chose to embody greatness, otherness, or antiquity in forms larger than life. This recurrence does not prove literal giants, but it does show that the image of giants was important enough to weave into the living fabric of community gatherings. Let us imagine for a moment. A village gathers each year to mark the harvest. In the center of the square, they raise a figure twice as tall as any person. It may be woven from reeds or carved from wood, its proportions stretched beyond the human frame. To the children, it is wondrous, frightening, unforgettable. To the elders, it is memory, a reenactment of beings who once were or once were imagined. Centuries later, when scholars find records of the festival, the figure is simply called the giant. Another step in thought takes us to funerary or ancestral rite. Imagine a lineage that remembers an unusually tall ancestor. To honor him, they make a mask broader than a face, a statue taller than a man. Each generation repeats the rite, even when the ancestor is no longer remembered as a person but only as a presence. The oversized form becomes tradition, its origin blurred, yet its size still speaking of difference. Before moving further, let us pause on the endurance of such forms. Unlike stories, which flow and change, rituals are repetitive, almost rhythmic. They create continuity, like waves returning to shore. Even if the sea changes, the rhythm feels the same. Giants in ritual may thus be less about memory of literal beings and more about preserving the feeling of encountering something greater, larger, older. And so we close softly. The rituals of giants remind us that myth is not only spoken but lived, embodied in festivals, dances, and ceremonies that endure through centuries. Whether they recall real beings or symbolic forces, their presence in ritual shows us how deeply the idea of giants shaped human imagination. In repetition, in scale, in rhythm, communities carried forward the impression of beings larger than themselves, keeping alive a quiet echo of possibility. What if the stories of giants are less about beings who once lived and more about the way memory itself works, stretching impressions across generations until the past becomes larger than life? Human memory is not a perfect archive. It is selective, fluid, and shaped by the needs of those who carry it. When we try to recall distant events, we do not replay them exactly. We reshape them, smoothing some details, exaggerating others. Over centuries, these adjustments grow. A tall neighbor becomes taller. A powerful ancestor becomes immense. A group remembered with awe becomes a race of giants. The context here is the scale of cultural memory. Oral traditions often span hundreds of years, passed from elders to children, from storytellers to audiences. Unlike written records, which freeze a moment, oral memory adapts. It keeps what feels important and discards what does not. If size was a mark of importance, then memories of the past naturally magnified it. In this way, giants may reflect the way communities remembered their history, filtered through awe and repetition. The mechanism of memory amplification is simple. Each retelling is an act of interpretation. Small differences accumulate like layers of paint applied again and again. A storyteller who wishes to impress may stretch a detail. Listeners may add emphasis in their own retellings. Over time, a figure remembered as tall becomes described as towering. Generations later, the story is no longer about a person but about a being of impossible size. Now we pause gently on what we cannot know. Without written sources from the earliest tellers, we cannot separate original experience from later exaggeration. Archaeology may confirm that a culture existed, but not the exact dimensions of those who inspired the tales. The traces left by memory are less precise than bones or stones. They are patterns of story, repeated across space and time, showing us not facts but tendencies. The language of traces here lies in comparative folklore. When we line up myths from different regions, we see the same outlines. Beings larger than humans, often set in the distant past, remembered as both creators and destroyers. These parallels suggest that the image of giants was not random. It may reflect a shared tendency of memory to enlarge what was powerful, impressive, or distant. The recurrence is a kind of data, not conclusive, but suggestive. Let us linger in a thought experiment. Imagine a child listening to a tale about a great warrior who stood taller than most. In the telling, the warrior is described as like a tree. Years later, when the child becomes a storyteller, the image has grown. The warrior is not just tall but taller than any man. Generations later, he is remembered as a giant. Another step in thought brings us to entire communities. Imagine a group that lived long before written record, known for strength or endurance. Later people, unable to recall details, remember only that they were greater than us. Over centuries, this impression transforms into literal height, solidified in story as giants who once walked the earth. Before we move further, let us pause on the humility required here. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not proof of presence. Giants in memory may be echoes of real encounters, or they may be the natural product of how human minds enlarge what they cannot fully grasp. Both paths are possible, and both remind us of the creative power of memory itself. And so we close gently. Giants may not point to a hidden species alone but also to the way we remember, the way we stretch the past to fit our sense of awe. They are less a record of measurement than a reflection of how stories grow. Whether rooted in real encounters or born of memory's magnifying lens, the giants of tradition remind us that human recollection is never small, it always enlarges what feels significant, until the past itself towers like a shadow on the horizon. What if the stories of giants are less about certainty and more about perspective, a way of reminding us that human history is vast, layered, and only partly understood. Giants, whether they were real beings or imagined figures, have walked with us in memory across continents and centuries. Their presence in myth, in stone, in place names, in rituals, and in language tells us something important, that we have always sensed scales greater than ourselves, and we have always sought to give shape to that sense. The context of this thought reaches beyond archaeology or folklore. It lies in the long relationship between people and time. When we look back, we do not see clearly. We see fragments, fossils, ruins, words, traditions. Each fragment is a clue, but none tells the whole story. Giants live in the space between these fragments, in the gaps that our imagination tries to fill. The mechanism of this persistence is simple. Human minds connect scattered signals into patterns. When we find large bones, we imagine large beings. When we see massive stones, we think of massive builders. When we hear of ancestors stronger or taller, we enlarge them in story. Over time, these patterns grow into myths, and myths become frameworks through which we understand the past. This does not prove giants lived among us, but it shows why the idea endures. Now we pause gently on what we cannot know. Bones may crumble, names may change, rituals may fade. The absence of evidence does not erase the possibility that once there were people unlike us, taller, stronger, or simply different in scale. Nor does absence confirm it. We remain between possibilities, guided by traces that are suggestive but not final. The language of traces here is wide. It includes geological layers where unusual remains appear. It includes archives where old words for great ones are written. It includes the statistical recurrence of myths that place giants at the beginning of time. None of these is decisive, yet together they form a quiet chorus, reminding us that the human past is larger than what survives. Let us linger in a final thought experiment. Imagine that one day, far in the future, all record of us is lost except for scattered fragments. Perhaps a few buildings remain, or a single word preserved in a child's rhyme. Future beings try to piece together our lives from these traces. Their picture would be incomplete, perhaps distorted. In the same way, our view of giants, whether real or imagined, is shaped by fragments. We cannot know the whole, only the shadows cast by what remains. Another step in thought brings us to the scale of time itself. Human memory rarely stretches beyond a few generations. Written record reaches further, but even it is only a thin layer compared to the millions of years of life on this planet. Against such immensity, it is not surprising that stories grow tall, that figures larger than life appear to anchor memory in a vast landscape. Giants may be a way of giving shape to time itself, making the distant past more tangible. Before we close, let us pause on the humility this invites. To think of giants is to think of the limits of our knowledge. It is to accept that much of the past is beyond our grasp, yet still close enough to leave whispers. Giants are part of those whispers. Whether they were flesh and blood, or symbols of awe, or both, they remind us that human history is not flat but layered, not small but expansive. And so we end softly. The stories of giants may not give us certainty, but they give us perspective. They teach us that even absence can speak, that memory enlarges what matters, and that the past is always greater than the fragments we hold. If this rhythm feels close to us, we know how to return, how to keep listening gently to the echoes that time leaves behind.